Okay, well, thank you, Ricky, and thanks everyone for joining us for this meeting of the Terrestrial Analogs Focus Group. We will also be recording this talk and posting it online for later viewing. We know that everyone's very busy these days, and so we're getting good views on the talks afterwards as well. So thank you for coming in person, and thank you for viewing it later as well. Just a quick reminder of what we have here. This is the Terrestrial Analogs Focus Group, sponsored by NASA SSERVI, the Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute. I'm Jen Heldman from NASA Ames Research Center, and I want to thank the co-chairs for this focus group, Tim Glotch from Stony Brook University and Darlene Lim, also at NASA Ames, for helping with the leadership of this focus group and helping pull together these seminars. Today, I'm very excited for this talk because this is a topic we haven't covered yet in the Analogs Focus Group. The medicine is real, the space is not. Lessons in analog medical care from 4 extreme environment simulations from Sheyna, Gifford, and Posselt. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to remind everyone what we're doing with this Analogs Focus Group. We have a charter. You can go online. The link is there at the bottom on the NASA SSERVI website. And we're really focused on terrestrial analog field studies to enable solar system exploration in science. And we recognize that field studies offer the unique opportunity to prepare for both robotic and human missions. So we want to use analogs to test science, mission operations, technologies, et cetera, in environments with relatively low cost and low risk before these activities go to flight. So through this Analogs Focus Group, we're aiming to bring together members of the community to discuss and review the various aspects of fieldwork, including and not limited to field sites, deployment logistics, field instrumentation, ConOps, software, hardware testing, and all the different research that goes on in these analog environments. So with that, I will turn it over to our speakers today and let them take over and give us their presentation.
Okay, thank you all so much. How's the audio? Can you hear me well?
Sounds great, thank you.
Fantastic. I'm Sheyna Gifford. This is my colleague, Dr. and Squadron Leader Bonnie Posselt. And we are very pleased to be here presenting this talk, Lessons in Analog Medical Care. We've presented versions of this talk at ASMA, the Aerospace Medicine Conference, and in other forums individually and jointly. We're very pleased to be giving it today because usually we have to start off this talk explaining what analogs are, why they're important, how they factor into space. And thankfully and gratefully, we don't have to do that now. We'd be preaching to the choir, so we get to move right on to the meat of it. Nonetheless, we'd like to ask you all, since we don't know most of you in person, if you'd be able to drop into the chat, let us know if you are an analog physician or a physician at all. If you've participated in a what we call expedition analog, something run by a space agency like NASA or ESA, or if you've participated in more of a community research analog, something like MDRS, Mars Desert Research Station, or High Seas. That way we can use the right vernacular and make sure we're not leaving anyone behind. So if you have the ability to drop a note into the chat, let us know what your experience is, then we'll be sure to include the correct information for you. So right on to the meat of it. This is going to be a very brief history through crewed space simulation, just so that we can bring you up to date with where we are now and how we got here. Then we can discuss the medical aspects of what's going on currently and talk about what our recommendations as a group of medical doctors and other sorts of medical practitioners who work in these analogs, what we have discovered and what we think can help benefit us as the community of analog users. And of course, analogs or simulations have been a part of crewed space simulation since the beginning, since before we actually went to space. We were stuffing people in mock-ups like the ones you see at the bottom there for Mercury and then Gemini, building these environments to train not only the crew, but the controllers and the doctors and everyone who would eventually be involved in the actual expedition. So these first simulations were expedition simulations, and they descended from a long history of just simulating for environments where you needed maximum safety, optimum performance at, as Jennifer was saying, a decreased cost and a decreased risk, although we'll talk about how that risk has been changing over time when it comes to medical health and safety risks in these analogs. But at first, we started simulating for space travel, for crewed space travel from day one, sparing no expense, doing some pretty outrageous and fantastic things, including for Apollo, building a 120-foot vacuum chamber with a full-scale model of the command module. And sparing no expense, this thing completely pressured down to basically nothing. Those carbon arc lamps you see on the left were actually solar simulators, and it was a full-scale model designed to actually offload 5-6G and allow people to live in that command module for up to 5 days. And you can see from the diagram, it was a complete functioning space simulation. This is about as high fidelity as you could ever possibly get. This space simulation ran first in 1966. It took them years from the time Kennedy announced in 61, we're going to the moon in this decade. Okie dokie. Well, first we have to figure out how to do that. At the time of that announcement, we'd spent a grand total of 15 minutes in space ever. So the idea of going to the moon and landing on the moon in an environment we've never been to was a little bit daunting. We started simulating right away. We ran this first test in August and October 1966 in that environment I just showed you. And as you might imagine, like the first time you try to do anything, drive, walk, date, it went badly. Yeah, it went really badly. Everything broke. It was intended to run for 5 days and instead ran for a little over 24 hours before they had to evacuate for crew safety. The power failed, the fuel cells flooded. It was raining indoors as the condensation dripped down the control panels and the windows. The crew had to get in their cabin suits because they lost power and those suits leaked. And last, but perhaps most embarrassingly, they had to inject their underwear out of the airlock because it was leaking a toxic fume. I believe it was a lithium fluorine. So that didn't go so well, but fortunately, this is a simulation. They took a deep breath, a few steps back, and they did it again. Look at the date, 1968. We were coming up on D-Day. But fortunately, the second time around in 1968, the series of tests ran for over 160 hours with no major failures. And they did a series of tests involving microbiology, immunology, the crew's ability to eat and exercise in space. That testing facility plus the lunar excursion module simulation, which you see here, allowed crew to practice landing that last 150 feet under the surface of the moon and know that, at least technically speaking, it was possible that they could do this, survive, and return to the Earth. What's interesting, though, is none of these were what you would call risk-free or even safe. You saw in 1966, the crew had to evacuate after having to be in their suits, which leaked. That lunar excursion module, you see there, the LEMS nearly killed Neil Armstrong. He had to eject to save his life. Then he went back to his office and did paperwork. That was just who he was. But these things were built on the fly in order to try and make something that was impossible possible. And that tradition of simulating space before we went on a series of missions just continued, increasingly safer and better over time. This is the SMEET Skylab medical experiment. Before we went to Skylab, we built this, again, pressure environment, pumped it down to 5 PSI, and put real astronauts in it for 56 days. That went fairly well. As far as I know, there were no major disasters. There was a minor disaster, as you see in the picture there. The gentleman standing in the middle next to the ergonometer exercise bike is named Bill Thornton. He was actually a flight surgeon himself, and all those are astronauts. That's Crippen and Bobko standing next to him. That was not supposed, all the equipment there was supposed to be flight certified, but that ergonometer was not. It broke on him several times, and at one point, Dr. Thornton just threw it out the airlock. But otherwise, that mission went extremely well, and they were able to prove, prior to sending people to Skylab, that people could exist in a 70% oxygen environment and still survive and thrive. So that was critical and important. We're moving on to the ISS. We're moving on to a new phase of crewed simulation. This is the Lunar Mars Life Support Test Project. Here we start to get a change of events. It's no longer astronauts or flight engineers in the simulation. It's community volunteers, but not the wider world community, the NASA community. The people you see standing on the gantry on the right are all NASA scientists. Most of them are biologists. One of the gentlemen standing on the top deck is actually Nigel Packham, who still works for the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance. He was actually stuck in the little variable pressure growth chamber you see in the middle there for 2 weeks all by himself, just to see if he and some wheatgrass could survive, and they could. This was a completely self-contained, sealed environment, and proved the point again that you should be able to send people to the ISS and let them live there for at least 90 days, at least in theory. So that brings us up through 2000. After 2000, you start to see this turn of events where it's the community staffing the simulations. Now we go from doing expedition simulations, things that precede a particular space mission, to research analogs, things that allow us to look into certain aspects of space in general. So on the left there, you see MDRS. They did a lot of psych studies, studies in physiology, immunology, group dynamics. On the right, you see desert rats, where they tested a lot of equipment, and that went on for many, many years, both of them. They were staffed by, yes, mostly scientists and people in the community, but they still had a lot of oversight. Desert Rats was run by NASA. Mars 500 had a lot of people monitoring it day and night. So these were very heavily monitored, but still they were more research analogs, and they were staffed by people who were not astronauts. And you can see that environment down there in the lower right, the Desert Rats environment, actually went on to be moved back to Johnson Space Center and is now functioning as HERA, the Human Research Analog, which I've been on, many people have been on. That's my crew down to the lower left. It's pretty small, it's cozy. My mission was 14 days, but they're going up to 45 now. Those are volunteers. So some of them are NASA, like my captain there sitting next to me on the left. He actually is a flight controller. And so is the very, very tall gentleman all the way to the left. Those guys both work at NASA now, but it could technically be any US citizen that meets astronaut qualifications. High Seas on the right is pure community driven. When it was High Seas, the University of Hawaii was involved. Now that it's Sensoria, as far as I know, the University of Hawaii isn't, and it's all community run. 1,200 square feet at 8,200 feet above sea level. So the trajectory, as you can see, has been steadily going from very high fidelity analogs for astronauts to, yes, high fidelity, but also run by NASA community volunteers, not just astronauts, to where we are today, where you have varying fidelities running in parallel. So you've got things as high fidelity as HERA, where you literally have mission controllers sitting on you night and day, to things like High Seas, where it's totally community driven, and you have worldwide volunteers who are on the mic with a 20-minute time delay available for 10, 12 hours a day, and the whole thing is community run. Analogs are now all over the map, quite literally and figuratively. Expedition analogs and research analogs are put side by side on NASA's own analog map. Right here you can see NEMO, which is for ASCANs and researchers, Concordia, which is for community, but mostly scientists and engineers, NEK, which is going to be serious, HERA right next to High Seas. And this isn't even the majority of analogs. As you can see at the bottom, the majority of analogs are out there in the community. Some of the analogs here have true flight surgeons. NEMO, for example. Some of them have HSOs or health and safety officers. Bonnie will tell you about that. That's High Seas when it was High Seas. Now that it's Sensoria, I don't even know. And for most of the ones on the bottom, we actually don't know. We don't know what kind of health and safety systems they have in place. So that being said, we just have to consider, as we go forward into Bonnie's part of the talk, the benefits and the risks to doing things this way, to simultaneously running expedition analogs with very high fidelity and NASA ESA level health and safety with whatever else might be happening. There are great benefits to this: public involvement, more participations, tons of locations, tons of data, but there are also risks. And some of those risks have already been realized and are currently being assessed and planned to be mitigated by a really great health and safety team.
Thanks, Sheyna. I'll let you continue to run the slides if that's okay, to save swapping screens. So again, thank you for having us. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the medical side of things. So we represent a group of medical professionals who have worked as health and safety officers in a number of different analog missions in different environments, so from the desert to Antarctica, to high altitude, to underwater and volcanic regions as well. We all met together and realised in our discussions that the level of care that we were providing, along with the resources that we had available to us, differed significantly. And a lot of our anecdotes revolve around what our expectations were going into these analog missions to what actually was provided. And because we identified this gap, we thought it was worth sharing our lessons and trying to raise awareness of this issue, so that then we can try and decide how to make it better and how to improve safety across a whole spectrum of analog missions. Next slide. So what is a health and safety officer? What can they offer you? Why would you even have one as part of your team? So for my mission with the Austrian Space Forum, we had two sets. We had medical officer in the field, but we also had a health and safety team back at Earth that was in communication. And for your analog mission, you need to kind of decide, if you're going to have a health and safety officer, what type do you want? Do you want one kind of offering support remotely, or actually in the field with the crew? So if they're in the field with the crew, they can monitor the health of the astronauts and of the general crew. And that is for the activities and experiments that they're doing, but also for general medical things, because general medical things occur. Rashes, illnesses, things like that happen. They can provide real time-specific, so real-time telemonitoring of your astronauts and crew and give safety oversight. Whereas back at Earth, they can do telemonitoring, but if you've got some sort of simulation time delay, there may be a lag on that. And they can flag up any issues with that slightly bigger world picture and oversight, and help with medical major incident management if one were to occur. And they can also participate in crew selection. So as Sheyna has mentioned, for the kind of training big agency missions, they used astronauts who are already highly selected and medically screened to participate. Whereas as you move towards community analogs, there certainly can be differing medical standards. So you need to kind of identify who is going to be allowed and why, and what sort of risk you're going to take. And ultimately, if you have a health and safety officer who is adequately resourced, who has planned and has got all their plans in place, they will cover your back. They are there to take that responsibility away from your organisation, because they will be responsible for it. So they're there to help you and help your mission run smoothly, and also make sure that the science and the data that you collect is valid. Next slide. And I think it's worth just saying now, because it sounds like from the chat, we've had people who have been involved in lots of different types of analog missions, but not necessarily from the medical side of things. And it's something that's apparent to Sheyna and I, obviously being in the medical community, but not everyone is necessarily aware that there are very different types of health and safety officers. There are different types of doctors, and there are different types of medical personnel. And what you decide to have as part of your team will depend on where you're going, will depend on what level of medical care you need, and depend on how autonomously that individual has to practice, or whether you decide to go for a situation where they're just involved in the planning and risk assessment, but you have a telecommunication that you then have access to a physician via telephone, but in your crew, you may only need a paramedic or a nurse to deliver that sort of medical care, and you're able to shift responsibility for someone who gets sick. You're able to evacuate them out and pass on that medical risk. However, if you're going to be really remote and you're going to be acting autonomously, you may want to include someone with a bit more, with a few more credentials. So someone who's been involved in pre-hospital care, someone who's had experience of dealing with emergencies, emergency medicine physician, maybe someone with a little bit of an aerospace background who understands occupational risk assessments. So not just responding to issues, but doing the selection beforehand, and the linking with equipment and machinery being used, and someone who's done expeditions in the past. So you need to make sure your HSO is properly trained, and also whether they have experience or not, or whether you need that. And it's important to understand what the expectations are. So as a crew, what are you expecting your doctor to be able to do? And it's important for the doctor to then make sure that the crew understand the limitations of their practice. So, are they able to deal with heart attacks or other sorts of emergencies, or are they more limited to cuts and scrapes and the planning side of things? So it's important to understand there are different types of doctors with different experience. Next slide. And it's because you're thinking about the health and safety officers, the challenge is to provide a degree of terrestrial level healthcare to conditions like this, to remote locations. And I'm sure you can all appreciate these are very different environments to what we're used to our shiny hospitals with all our resources and our tests and our equipment. So the challenge for the health and safety officer is to provide care to these places. So underwater, hot desert locations, altitude, cold, remote places. Next slide. And not just that, but people aren't just going on nice strolls in these environments or swims, is they're doing science, they're doing physical activities. There's the added risk of what they're doing, of the space flight simulation, that's an added challenge to providing healthcare. Next slide. So how do you do it? How do you even go about, as a health and safety officer, trying to think about providing healthcare or minimising any risks of instances? Well, you need to plan. And first of all, before anything happens, before you go anywhere, you'd ideally want to do a risk assessment. So that involves having a think about what hazards exist, and what's the consequence of an instance happening, and what's the likelihood of it happening. So if something was really serious, like a heart attack, so that's a really serious event. However, if you screen and you kind of don't allow people who are at risk of a heart attack, then the likelihood of it happening are really low. So the actual overall risk of a heart attack, even though it's serious, you bring that risk down for it to become a kind of a low or medium risk. And as you're doing your risk assessment, it's important to realise that there's different categories of assessment. So first of all, you just look at your environment, and that will be unique to wherever you're going. So for example, in the desert, you have the risk, so you have hazard of heat, which then has the risk of developing heat illnesses or heat stroke, which are extremely serious if they occur in a remote place without access to kind of intensive care sort of treatments. Whereas an underwater location has the hazard of higher pressure, which runs the risk of decompression sickness. So they're different hazards depending on where you're going. Look at your activities. What sort of experiments are you going to be conducting? What equipment are you using? Is there the risk of trauma occurring? You know, are you using heavy machinery? So you then need to be able to mitigate that. And then general. So what's the crew that you're taking? How many people are you taking? Because general things occur generally, like toothache, rashes, some nausea and sickness. Things kind of just generally occur in your crew. Next slide. So you've identified all of your hazards now, and your risks. So what do you then do about it? Well, you plan, and you plan for what would you do if those risks were occur. Am I going to just accept that risk as it is, or am I going to try and bring that risk down? And the way that you can do that is by planning. So you need a flight plan, you need a research plan. How are you going to conduct the experiments? Who's going to conduct them? What are the risks of doing them? And how do I kind of mitigate any risks? And the way that you do that is, okay, so what about all of the individuals who are going to be using this equipment, train with this equipment before they are using it in the field? You might think that that's obvious, but from my personal experience, we were a volunteer group of individuals, and some people, because they had to take time off work to participate, they didn't have time to take part in the kind of dress rehearsals. So they turned up and they'd never used some of the equipment, which carries a greater risk if they misuse it or it causes injury. The HSO should definitely have a major incident plan. So if there were an emergency to happen, where do you evacuate that person to? How do you evacuate them? How do you break simulation in some time delay? What emergency comms do you have? Do you have access to a satellite phone? How do you call for help? And these are all really important things to think about, because the last thing you want to do is to start thinking about what to do once an incident's occurred, because then you're in a real sticky situation. So look at your people, depending on where you're going and what activities you're doing. Do you need to select people? Do you need to rule out people who have chronic medical conditions? Do you have to have a BME team, so a biomedical engineer team, monitoring remotely? Is there the possibility of running a preparation weekend beforehand? Medical indemnity is an important one from the medical side of things. So you can't just rely on the Good Samaritan principle of, if something were to happen, an HSO or someone who's done first aid training, diving in and helping out. Because you plan to do this mission, that is invalid. So you need to make sure that the medical personnel or the health and safety officer has a legal ability to practice, and they're covered by their medical insurer, and the people themselves. So who's going to cover the cost of a ambulance or helimed evacuation if you need to do that? And these are important things, because if a participant has to shoulder that cost or that risk, then that might change their decision on whether to participate or not. And what you don't want to be doing is be giving someone a bill once an incident's occurred later on. It's not kind of the done thing. And think about your provisions. So you've identified a hazard. Okay, how do I reduce that risk? Okay, make sure I've got the right equipment and the right drugs that are in date, and that I've got an area that I can treat people if I need to. Next slide. So do you really need to do all of this? Do you really need to do a risk assessment and make all these plans? It seems like a lot of effort. In our opinion, yes, you do. Even just from our small group of 6 people, these are some examples of real life things that have happened. And whilst big agencies have access to investigation systems, reporting systems, in a lot of community analogues or academic run analogues, there is no reporting system. There's no record of these things occurring. So there's not necessarily a way to learn from them. And just to highlight some of the things that we have occurred. So I personally experienced a heat illness in individuals that had the potential to be very serious. There's been musculoskeletal injuries. We've had one of our crew members experienced decompression sickness in the underwater analogue. Altitude sickness has been reported, insomnia, battery fires, some burns, a loss of communications, pressure sores, minor cuts and abrasions, toothache, fall from a quad bike that again had the potential to be quite serious. Luckily the individual was fine. And then on a slightly lower scale, low mood, cognitive underperformance, are those things that your health and safety officer is equipped to deal with, and do they know how to manage it? Okay, next slide. So this is a busy slide. I'm not expecting you to read this, but this is just to highlight to you. This is a graph of all of the adverse incidents that have occurred in human spaceflight, according to the agencies. And it's a great infographic. And what we as a group, as a kind of a medical professional group, would love to have is something similar like this for all analog missions. So to have a reporting system that you'd be able to say, hey, in this analog, in a desert analog, I had 2 members who suffered from heat stroke. This is what we did, and this is what the outcome was. And if we could do it again, this is what we would have had. And to log that so that we know that this is a real risk, and there are case examples of this happening. At the moment, our group is just trying to raise awareness that there is this big gap. So nothing like this exists for the majority of analogs, because as Sheyna has explained, the majority of analogs now are community-led and community-run. And we're currently working with the different populations, different groups, to try and work out how best to improve safety across the board. Next slide. And again, just to remind everyone that yes, the space is simulated, yes, in order to get the research done, but the medicine's real, the people are real, and the people have the right to know what their healthcare is going to be, who's it going to be delivered by. So are you going to have a doctor on site, or you're going to have someone with some first aid training who then links with a doctor via telephone? Because they have a right to know that. Because that's the only way that they can then make an informed decision about their participation. And just to say, they're not real astronauts who should be kind of treated according to the Outer Space Treaty, but it increases your fidelity, it increases the fidelity of the whole simulation if you treat them as astronauts. Next slide. So as a group, these are some of our recommendations that may help in your planning of an analog mission. So to embed a safety culture, to embed that kind of hands up, anyone being able to say, I'm not happy with that, or let's foster a reporting system or a kind of a support network. We would strongly suggest to have an independent safety team out of simulation. We know that's not always possible. I certainly, from my experience, didn't have that. And I know that Sheyna didn't have that in her simulations either. But that really takes away any conflict of interest that the doctor who's in simulation may have to, they may want to finish this experiment, they may want to get the data out of it. Whereas if you have someone who's kind of separate from the sim, they are then more inclined that it's easier for them to say, stop, this isn't safe, let's reassess. Whereas when you're in the simulation, it's very easy to get the blinkers on and not see the bigger picture. And again, I use an example of, I had an analog astronaut who was on an EVA working very hard and was fine to start with, but then started developing some symptoms. And it was very difficult for me to say, shall I stop and shall I reassess them? And it actually took my Earth-based team to say to me, hey, what's wrong with this guy? Are you going to go and sort this? And suddenly I was like, absolutely. I've had validation from my support from my peers. Yes, I need to sort this now. So ideally, that would be great, but we appreciate that it's not possible in all cases. Whatever you do, involve the health and safety officer early so that they can make these plans. Again, what you don't want to do is start a mission, have your doctor turn up on day one and say, where's the major incident plan? And everyone suddenly look at each other and be like, oh. It takes a while to sort these things out. So plan them early, and they can help inform you on certain things that they might say, hey, let's do a crew selection, or let's do a medical questionnaire just to check that people are okay before they go. Establish expectations and limitations. I've already spoken about that, but it's important that crew members know that their doctor might not be able to do things that they would expect, but it's important to know that beforehand and marry up those expectations and limitations. So the HSO should do a risk assessment with the organisation and identify then what mitigations they're going to put in place. Have standard operating procedures and use them. Establish who's going to be able to break simulation and at what point. How do you facilitate that? Report your adverse instances, near misses, otherwise no one else will be able to learn from them. So currently there's not a way of doing that internationally. This is what we're hoping for and working towards. However, certainly within your organisation, flag up that an instance has occurred to try and prevent it happening further. And all of these things will help your crew make informed decisions about participation and will help improve the fidelity of the data that you're collecting. Okay, I'll hand back over to Sheyna for the last few slides.
All right. So, from a practical standpoint, what might this look like? Well, we're here to ask you guys that question. You guys are the analog community. So, we're doctors and we've been involved in a few simulations, but this is your field. So, in terms of grading a sim, in order to have greater transparency and to communicate to the participants, here are the safety issues, risks that are involved in a simulation. Do we grade sims? Do we say, okay, here's just a comparison table of some very well-known simulations, Hera and Nemo, but here's high seas and Amity. Hera has a calm delay, goes from 5 minutes, nothing to 5 minutes to 10 minutes, and then reverses course when you go back to Earth. Nemo doesn't. High seas, Sensoria, Amity do, and they're fixed. NASA provides medical and safety for Hera and Nemo, does not provide that for certain other analogs. So given everything, including the environment and the possible physical and psychological risks, we've given these a safety grade. Do we do this or something like this so that we can communicate to community participants what they're actually signing up for? We don't know. We're here to ask you and to talk to you about that. But more to the point, at the end of the day, we're basically here to say, we're doing a new approach to simulations. By and large, simulations are now research, not expedition, though expedition are still happening as always. And the majority of simulations are community-based. So how do we handle that? How do we develop a new approach for this new era of space simulation? Do we have a core of simulated astronauts who have been screened and we know all kinds of things about them in terms of their health and psychology? Do we rank sims like we just gave an example of? Do we develop an incident reporting system? This is something we've talked about in SMOG, our space working analog group, multiple times, to develop kind of a way for everyone involved, not just the doctors and the HSOs, but all participants, all the administration of analogs, to report incidents that happen so they can become part of a beautiful infographic and we can all plan for a better future. We don't know. We think that some combination of these and other things is necessary now, because just like in space, in simulation, you don't get a day off. Everything breaks. And just because it's a practice run doesn't mean that terrible things can't happen. They have happened. And part of our job is to try and keep them from happening again. So with that, we're going to open up the floor. Please feel free to turn on your microphones, your video, and ask us any questions, start a discussion. We'd love to hear from you.
Great, thank you, Bonnie and Sheyna. Right, if people have questions, you're free, if you have the ability, you can unmute, and or there's some comments in the chat that I'll read as well. And also just to start the discussion, so this is great, and I think we're aligned philosophically. So from the NASA side, especially at NASA Ames, when we go out and do an analog activity, and Darlene Lim is on too, she's done a lot of these with Ames, we are required to do a very comprehensive safety plan. We have to go through the EERRB, which is Extreme Environment Research Review Board. It includes not just science, but it includes the medical officers that are at Ames. We put together a 100+ page document outlining everything from, as you are going through, you know, the potential risks, how we would mitigate that, what we would do in the event that something happens, the nearest hospitals, the whole gamut. So I understand that that is a NASA requirement that we are required to do. And so I don't know how that, so I just want to make the point that some of this is happening, which is great, because for all the reasons that you have stated, this is incredibly important for the health and safety of the people that are participating in these analogs, and also for the research aspect. So what I don't know is how that rigorous safety process translates to, as you were saying, the community-based analog activities. And Rodrigo Romo is on, who is a part of High Seas. He may have some insights into how High Seas runs that as well. But so some of this is happening. And so maybe there is a way to take what NASA has done, which I think done a pretty good job, and, you know, share that with the community. So that's one comment. And Penny Boston made a point. I was thinking about this too. I'll just read what she said, that reporting incidents is tricky. Working within a government organization, it's our duty to report all incidents. And that's true. We've had minor incidents and we are required, and we do report them. However, there can be strong reluctance to report anything other than major incidents because of the potential jeopardization of future activities. Further, in independent community groups or university expeditions, there's the same fear. And community efforts often depend upon federally or state managed study sites and are in fear of losing their permits and access. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on how to make that balance, right? And it's historically been a source of push and pull within the astronaut corps as well, right? Because you don't want the medical officer to be the one telling you can't fly. So how do you approach that tension between those two sides?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one we've all struggled with in our practices. From the flight surgery side, you know, we are the maker and breaker of dreams. You know, we don't want people to get grounded. On the other hand, sometimes you have to either ground or limit people, which we hate doing.
We're also enablers.
Yes.
Enable.
Yeah, or be enablers, right? So you have to strike that balance. But safety culture, we think, is kind of the answer to this. And we think that because NASA has been, by and large, not perfectly, but by and large, very successful in making safety culture a top priority. So the highest prize one can win, be awarded, is the Silver Snoopy, and it's for safety. The department at Johnson Space Center that reports the most safety hazards gets a pizza party. You know, they get rewarded for reporting. So you develop this system of reward. It's not about punishment. It's not about shame. There's no punishment. There's no shame. In fact, there's reward. You know, hey, you reported that there was a nail sticking out from the bottom of a desk, and that, there's a sign over the doorway hitting people in the head, and there was a crack in the floor, and now you get pizza. I mean, great, right? What harm is there in that? And so safety culture is not easy. It's hard. Hospitals fight this all the time, right? All kinds of workplaces fight this all the time. This is part of occupational risk, is to say, yeah, we don't want you to stop reporting. We need to encourage you to report. We promise nothing terrible will happen to you, but people always have that latent fear. So how to reassure people that they are safe, they're in a safe place, and that this is the right thing to do is a question that we've been trying to fight for many years. But a really good safety culture is one in which people do feel comfortable and even rewarded in reporting issues that concern them. Maybe they're not even real. They just want to make sure they're not going to be a source of harm to someone.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that first of all, we know that NASA do these things right. We know that there are a lot of really responsible analogs out there that do things right. But I think the issue comes from then assuming that everyone else does the same. And that simply is not true. And that's why we are here talking to you now. And so, yes, it's small steps at a time. And whilst you may feel like a small member within a large crew, safety culture starts with you. So if you're getting involved in an analog mission, you're completely within your rights to say, hey, if I broke my leg, what would happen to me? And like you say at NASA, they already have a plan for that. They've done a 100-page document. They know where they're going to take you to. There are a lot of analogs out there that would say, nah, it's not going to happen. You'll be fine. So we're just trying to raise awareness. And again, it sounds like we might be preaching to the converted a little bit with the NASA folk, but to make the NASA folk aware that this doesn't happen across the board. And if you're dealing with any other analog groups, again, that safety culture of, hey, what are you doing with your instances? And if they turn and say to you, we've not had any instances ever, that they're lying, because instances happen. And this is why we're here, really. So we're really, really grateful that we're on board, and it's great to hear that you seem to have a well-established process for dealing with this, but we're trying to reach out to other people. And I've seen in the chat, actually, we're now starting to get some anecdotes, and it's really great because this is where they start drawing up, and people are actually like, oh, well, this thing did happen. This is what we want to bring up. And we want to get people to speak up, and we want to embrace that and make sure that we can help as many people as we can, because we want to stop something serious happening. And so from my personal experience, in our analog, we were very close to a serious incident happening. And it's only now with hindsight that I think about how close a serious incident could have happened. It gives me nightmares. And it definitely has changed the way I would approach going and planning for an analog. But I also want other medical personnel who are getting involved in an analog to learn from what, to learn from my experiences. And as a working group, we're also trying to publish a paper outlining what the key things to think about if you are going to be providing healthcare to a group, because your group might not be like NASA with a 100-page document and risk assessment already done. You may be having to do that yourself. And I'm sure, again, you can grab Sheyna and I, and we have loads of stories just between the two of us on things that have happened.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. That's great.
Everything from toxic exposures. I've literally seen crew poisoned. It was not good. But, once that happened, we were able to prevent it from reoccurring. But before we go ahead and call on others, and I see hands up and people who want to talk, another way to look at it is not just, okay, how do we prevent risk? Well, no one can prevent risk. There's always going to be risk. We should just learn to live with it. It's actually, this is what we're here to do. We're here to identify and mitigate risk. This is part of the space experience. And if you're really into space and you really love space and you want to be traveling to space, if you want to be a space explorer, assessing, mitigating, and reassessing and remitigating risk is all part of that journey. It's part of the adventure. It's part of our rights and responsibilities. So, safety culture is one aspect of it, and understanding that this is just as much a part of your life in space as maintaining your spacesuit, checking the power in the hab, and checking the water purity. This is all part of it. Is let's run our checklist. Let's see where we are. Let's see what hazards we can identify and run through them. It's just all part of life in space. Okay.
Great. I see Darlene Lim has her hand up. So Darlene, do you want to unmute and speak?
Sure. Hi. First of all, thank you so much for that great talk, Bonnie and Sheyna. I, totally agree. As Jen was saying, philosophically, you put out so many important concepts that absolutely, you have alignment on, I think, for many of us. And I think one of the important points you brought up is that when we go into the field, it's not a summer camp, it's a workplace. And I think that transition I've seen over the last 20 years of my career in analog work really start to happen actually over the last, I'd say, minus a couple of years of a decade sort of thing, which is a really good thing, because there are lots of things we would not do in a workplace that sometimes we felt that was okay to do in an analog space, and that makes it unsafe. So I think that transition is really important. Now, one thing I wanted to bring up is conflict of interest. And, in terms of embedding safety personnel, medical personnel, I think that's really important. We've always had a safety crew on many of our larger analog missions. But one thing that I've resisted, and I can tell you stories too about lots of downward pressure to include safety personnel within the crew as well, and have them experience, some of the quote unquote fun things which are associated with the field. And I've resisted that because I think it puts them in a place of conflict in terms of conflict of interest, because a lot of times we want the safety team to make a judgment about whether or not a circumstance is safe, whether or not the air quality has plummeted so much in a volcanic area, we shouldn't go out there, whether or not the rain has come in, and it's not safe and so forth. But I think in some cases, there are circumstances where I've seen that when there are people that are too deeply embedded, they'll make calls which aren't necessarily for the greater good, but are for their good. And so I'm being very frank about this. And of course, it's case by case, but it's something that I've become acutely aware of over the last couple of decades, and really try and maintain a very low level, or strike it out entirely from our environments. That is conflict of interest. So I'll pause there.
All right. Before we call on Rodrigo, Bonnie, did you want to respond?
I would just like to say, I think that's a really wise thing that you're doing, to have a separate safety team or someone just with that bigger picture who has the ability to cut through all of the organizational, kind of the flight director, to cut through all of that and say, I think there's an issue here, is invaluable. And again, just to reiterate what you're saying, that this is great. Analogs are great fun, and we want to enable them to happen, but they're not. They are serious, with serious consequences if instances were to occur. So they're not all just a fun day out. I completely agree with you, and I think you should definitely continue your stance of having your safety team slightly separate from the main crew. I think that's a great idea. Again, we want to try and highlight these sorts of ideas to other or across all analogs.
Yeah. No, having a separate safety team that is not just separate from the ground crew, but separate from the administration, who doesn't have a conflict, who can say, you know what, I'm looking at the weather map, I'm looking at what NOAA's saying about the carbon monoxide, and I'm saying, nope, I know you want to do this experiment, I know you all want to go have fun, but the answer is no. It's great to have somebody like that. We also need experienced HSOs who know about ground truth. And you and I have been out there a lot on the lava fields, tripping over the breaking up the Pohoi. I fell a meter down and slapped my knee and got a bunch of ligamentous tears falling through some very old lava. That's the ground truth of it. And because I know that, I think I'm a better HSO. And what I'd like you to know, and bear in mind, I would by no means ever tell you what to do and how to run your sim, but having somebody who's been out there, run around in the cave, see the skylights collapsing, knows what it's like to crawl down a rope thing into the cave to get this, the measurements we want, is to say, okay, I'm not loving this, but we're going to do doctor, patient, or HSO crew joint decision making. You really want to go. The administration really wants you to go. I will either sign off or definitely not stop you. I would prefer if you bring extra batteries, or if we have a relay so that we don't lose comms, or that you bring, this, that, and the other into the field in case you injure yourself. I'd appreciate it if you come back up out of the cave every 2 hours and check in with me, that kind of a thing. Does that make sense? Like, you don't need to.
That makes tons of sense. And that's exactly, yeah, I completely agree with that in terms of like case by case, having the empathy is very, very, very important. Absolutely. That's another issue that I, actually refrain from bringing up, is a lot of time you have a safety crew as well who can judge without experience. And that actually is almost as dangerous. So
Exactly.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, thank you.
And it's important, like, we understand that people have spent many years planning for these missions. We're not there just to say, no, don't do this. Otherwise, what's the point of getting out of bed in the morning? We're there to make things happen, and we're there to shoulder the responsibility and take those worries off of your shoulders. But we need to be working with commanding officers who understand that when we do say no, we're saying no for a reason.
Yeah.
And when we're saying yes and something were to occur, I can hold my head up high, stand in a court of law and say, because things do happen, but you can stand up and say, well, these are the procedures that we had in place to stop something from occurring. It did occur, and all my peers will judge me that I did the right things, and I will take responsibility for what did happen.
Yeah. I mean, the number one things that guide doctors in our practice are autonomy. Number one, you have the right to make your own choices. I can't ground you. I can only make recommendations and not make recommendations, except when I'm working at NASA as an actual flight surgeon, then I ground people. But if I'm out there on an analog, I say, you know what, it is my recommendation based on X, Y, and Z that you do, A, B, and C, but you're an adult and we're all volunteers and you do as you will. I will support you. And there were times when my crew wanted to literally put a rope over a giant skylight and dangle down over the skylight over it with a 50-meter drop. Said, I'm not loving that, but mission control said you could go do it. I'll hold the radio. You let me know if you get into trouble. I've talked to the firemen.
It's important that you are able to communicate to the organization that if something were to happen, you are liable, because I have said that my hands are clean.
Yeah, I was less concerned with liability than with rescuing my crew. But there was also another doctor on the ground, and it was his license. And this is getting into issues of like licensure and indemnity that I think most people here aren't super interested in. So I'll stick with more how to run an analog. But just from a medical legal standpoint for the other doctors in the room, my license wasn't directly on the line. Joe D'Angelo's was, but I did have an EMT license that was on the line. I did have my ability to get my license when I went back to the mainland on the line. I, of course, was going to be, a party to anything that happened. But yeah, no, it was like mission control said, go. I don't make the final call. Like Kjell Lindgren once said to me when he was up there and I was stuck I was up in a dome for a year. He said, "You're a resource." And I think most HSOs think of themselves that way, as a resource. I'm not judge and jury. I'm just here to give you information and try to help as best I can. So if you want to include an HSO in your crew, maybe screen for that, what their personal philosophy is about what they're there to do. And Bonnie sort of alluded to that earlier, is make sure they have a very clear concept of their job and that you all are on the same page about what their job actually is.
That's great. I see that Rodrigo and Penny have their hands up, so we'll do Rodrigo first and then go to Penny.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you. And thank you, Sheyna and Bonnie, for this great talk. Just a little clarification, Jennifer. I'm with Pisces, not with HISES. We are in Gila too, and we do collaborate with HISES quite a bit. I've had the opportunity to spend a couple of nights at the Habitat, but I did spend 6 months as a member of the second crew in Biosphere too. I was the safety officer in the crew, and one of the biggest differences I see between, for instance, what we did at Biosphere and the analogs like the Mars research or the HISES is the amount of time the crews spend together before the mission. I know it has to do with financial constraints and whatnot, but to give you an example, I started my training as a crew member a year ahead of my mission, and part of my training, as part of my background, I had rock climbing, mountain climbing, and mountain rescue experience, and I was a certified scuba diver. So I volunteered to be the safety officer. Part of my training included taking a rescue diver training course, taking an EMT course and become state certified EMT. And then the whole crew as a crew, and I started working with crew members a year ahead of my mission. Our crew as a crew started working together 6 months before our mission. Every day we worked together. Every day we try to learn the systems inside the biosphere. Every day we communicated with the current crew to find out what was going to be needed for the second crew, what was going to be needed during transition. And that time spent together is really important in my point of view. The first crew did have a medical doctor, and they did have to take one of the crew members out due to a medical procedure that the doctor in the biosphere was not able to take care of. My crew, we did not have a doctor. I was a safety officer, but I did have a full line of doctors available to my disposal to reach out to in case of any emergency. Fortunately, we didn't have any medical issues, but addressing the first point in the comment, the hesitation to report incidents, the one case we did have, a crew member slipped on the slippery surface of the rainforest and had some bruising on the thigh. First thing was to take the crew member into the medical facility and contact one of the medical doctors. At that point, this crew member just flipped. Said, "Don't call him. What are you doing? I don't want to." I said, "Look, as an EMT, I can't even give you an ibuprofen without a doctor telling me to do so. I have to call a doctor. But it's going to go on my record, and I don't want this. Why are you calling? And nothing happened to me. Just let me go." So it is real, both from the safety officer perspective and from the crew member perspective. So yeah, and then another big difference between the biosphere, and I understand biosphere is completely different from the analogs like the Mars research and HISES. But one thing that biosphere did have was, because it was a completely sealed, self-sustained system, the monitoring of the air quality and the water quality was a full day job that required attention every day. And that was one of my jobs, to monitor the air quality throughout the year and monitor what gases were building up. You know, the first crew had issues with a depletion of oxygen. Our crew had an issue with high nitrous oxide level going on. So having that as part of your daily routines does add a significant amount of stress to the behavior and the well-being of the crew. And also, it's good to see a lot of known names in this talk. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that input and that feedback. We have a few minutes left. So Penny, do you want to unmute and have the last comment?
Yeah, hi, everybody. And this is great. Really appreciate Sheyna and Bonnie, you weighing in on this. It's something that many of us have been dealing with in various ways for many decades. One of the things that I think is very difficult for us is that currently within NASA, within other organizations that have the responsibility for go, no-go decisions on expeditions, we face a very mixed picture in terms of how much knowledge, information, and in fact, medical or field experience that the deciders have. And this introduces an extremely idiosyncratic element into the vetting process for the types of safety plans that Jen was mentioning earlier, and that many of us have had to produce. And I've dealt with this both having NASA people and ESA people on expeditions before I went back to NASA a few years ago. And now, of course, I deal with it from inside NASA. And JPL, for example, has a notoriously capricious and sometimes what I would deem to be over the top response to reasonable hazards that are unavoidable in accessing a lot of sites. So for example, just to give you one anecdote, access to Lechuguilla Cave, where you have to cave for many days in order to get to some of the study sites. They almost refused to allow their personnel to go in because that meant that you weren't within a couple of hours reach of a hospital. Okay, I mean, the very nature of that site means that special considerations have to be made. And so I think one of the areas that we have not attended to, those of us who are practitioners on the exploration and research side is, how do we work with our aerospace medical community to better train and communicate expectations of different analog site inherent dangers and the risk assessment of those, just like we would do with the risk assessment of missions, right? So I think that this is a big hurdle, and sometimes it's not a hurdle at all, and sometimes it's almost insurmountable. And this also applies to those who make the decisions to let us access various sites. So some national parks are wonderful to work with, and some are a nightmare and almost impossible, right? So I think we've all experienced that. And so I'd be very interested in your thoughts, either during this presentation or even afterwards, about how do we bridge this gulf of understanding with those who are our safety officers within organizations, let alone the whole issue of private efforts, community efforts.
That's a really great question, Penny. If anyone is running out of time, I understand. I took the day off of work, but if I hadn't, I would be running back. Please feel free to drop us an email, find us on Twitter. Happy to continue the conversation. Penny, I'd love to answer it if you can stick around. Bonnie, do you want to go first?
I guess what I'd like to say is that a decent HSO hopefully would be on board that risks are fine to take as long as you understand the risk and you've done what you can to mitigate, to bring it as low as is reasonably practicable. Otherwise, we wouldn't even bother getting out of bed in the morning. Like I say, as long as you know what the hazard is, you're informed and you work out what you could do if something were to happen, and I've done everything in my power to prevent it from happening, I think that is adequate for that risk to be taken. It needs to be you need to have good communication with your flight director and the organizer, and those streams of conversation need to be established early on so that you are explaining what risks are, what you've done, and so they say to them, okay, well, who's holding this risk, who is responsible? Particularly I work in the Air Force, and we put people in fighter jets and run the risk of people, very real risk of people dying, and how do we reduce that risk down, apart from, to say, oh, well, let's just not fly. Yeah, of course, I reduce my risk to zero, but that's not practicable. So you do need to take risks, but as long as they are informed risks and they've been as mitigated as much as possible, and everyone in the group knows about them, then I think that is reasonable. What is dangerous is when you're taking risks and no one knows what the risks are, and that's where the danger is.
Have you guys written a position paper that we could cite, or could we?
It's going through peer review at the moment.
Do that?
Unfortunately, peer review is a long process. We submitted it about 4 months ago, and we're in our second round of dealing with our editors' comments. But we are, as a group, we've put together a position paper highlighting the gaps in this area and making suggestions of what minimum standards should be. And again, I'm just really heartened to hear of the anecdote to what it is that we're trying to achieve.
That's great news to hear that you guys are actually putting something out there in print that we can begin to build a literature around.
Yeah, I mean, just so you know, we've gone through one, series of rounds, but we may or may not decide to ultimately publish there. What would be the most accessible forum for you guys to be able to read this position paper with recommendations? Where would you go to if you had this question on your own? Where would you go to try to answer it?
Well, Astrobiology, the journal Astrobiology, might be willing to publish such a thing. That would certainly get the attention of a lot of people who work on analogs for the purposes of astrobiology. I would suggest that maybe a special session devoted to this at the American Society for Microbiology annual meeting at some point. That would reach even beyond astrobiology into folks who do Earth related analog work, maybe Geological Society of America, maybe the ASGSR, which is the American Society for Gravitational and Space Research. They have a journal. So there are really, a number of places that would be good to write concept papers or something and see if they would be able to accommodate that. I mean, this is very widely of interest, not just to biological scientists, and a lot of us on this call are biology people, but certainly geologists, atmospheric scientists, etc. I mean, everybody does expeditions.
These are really important. These are really useful suggestions. Thank you very much. Over the last year, we've mostly just been targeting the medical community, but as you've mentioned, absolutely anyone and everyone who's involved in analog mission, we need buy-in from them. So thank you very much.
Yeah, we're the user community, right? And
absolutely.
And that's where you need to get the buy-in. And a lot of us are very well aware of this. Some of us have been on expeditions where people were seriously injured. I was myself on several occasions, and have been on expeditions where people actually died. So, we take it very seriously. I think people who've been through that take it very seriously, but we don't want people to have to experience that in order to take it seriously, right? So,
absolutely.
Exactly right. Exactly right. By way of striking the balance, I'd say, and answering the previous question, I'd say it's all about the setup. So, the setup is, we've run the risk tables for most of what we think are the likely things and even some unlikely things. And periodically, once a month, once every 2 weeks, just like we have mission briefings, we have a safety briefing, and we see how well those risk tables are serving us, and we update. And it's just like checking the water, checking the air, checking the food, checking the power, checking the safety. It's just one of the many checklists. Welcome to space. We live and die on checklists, hopefully not die, but we make our living by checklists. So that I just think integrating safety is a part of it, and then setting up the relationship with your health and safety officer to be a resource, not a maker and breaker of dreams, not somebody who makes decisions in a vacuum, or not in a vacuum, depending on your analog, but who, is there to say, here's what I'm considering when I'm hearing this, here's what I would recommend, and here's what I can do for you. Just like Chell did on the ISS. He was a doctor, but that wasn't his function there. People would come to him with headaches and insomnia, and he'd say, yeah, let's just get you comfortable and do this, to help you out. But he wasn't the doctor. The doctor was back at, was sitting in a chair back at Mission Control Houston. He was a resource. And I really like that piece of advice he gave me as the HSO. And I am a doctor, but living with your patients is weird. So I decided to just kind of think of myself as a resource. And I did have a crewmate once tell me that she didn't like my bunk because it reminded her of a doctor's office. And then that's when I put the sugar-free lollipops away. But, you kind of keep I kind of kept them, by the desk, because I didn't have a medical bay. People had to get examined in my bunk room, whenever they had issues. So it's hard to draw the line personally and professionally. So it's an ongoing conversation. It's a moving target, and everyone just recognizes that there are no definitives, and we're all going to be working through this process together. And like Rodrigo said, that requires a base of trust. And I'm really glad he brought that up, because it's about trust and communication. And this is the real deal. This is part of why we simulate, so that we can have these experiences and say how well it worked or didn't work. As for the reporting thing, I hear you. I once caught a crew member going into my Ford MD only bucket, bye Tim, for MD only bucket, pulling out a medication. And there's a whole stack of medications anyone can access at any time without talking to me. But this person was going into the MD only bucket. And I found them reaching in there by coincidence. And I said, what can I do to help? What's going on? They didn't even want to tell me. So I'm not going to tell anybody. That's not how this works. There's no reporting instrument here. So we all don't want to admit what's going on, and we don't want to get reported or report. The way I handled safety reports is I said, this happened this week. I wouldn't say who, just that it happened. So I think it's less important that it happened to me necessarily than that it happened, period, meaning it could happen to somebody else. So you have to start thinking about it as an act of group effort to say, I'm going to report that this thing happened, not because it happened to me, but because I want to save my crewmates and other future explorers. So again, you have to kind of change the mindset. This is safety culture. It's not about me, it's about the environment and trying to make it. I would have been the most pop. Yes, they were sugar-free lollipops though, and the Europeans thought they were gross. Just it's a mindset thing. Report it to prevent harm to others. So sometimes shifting that focus to others is really helpful.
Yeah, well, this has been great. We are past the hour, but obviously there's great interest and people have been sticking around and participating. So a few thoughts are that Sheyna and Bonnie, once your paper is published, we can distribute it through the Analogs focus group email listserv, and that will reach a broad spectrum of people. There's over 150 people on that list now. So that's one thing. And then another thing is this conversation, I mean, the work is not done yet, right? Like we still need to work on this. So we do have an annual meeting of the Analogs Focus Group. It's usually in July in concert with the Exploration Science Forum. So this might be a good topic for that discussion. And then to piggyback on what Penny was saying, you know, SSERVI's, the ESF, the Exploration Science Forum might be a good place to discuss this as well at that meeting, because there's a lot of analog groups that work there. So we can help work offline and try and connect you with some of the other planetary analog groups and meetings and that sort of thing, if you're willing.
Oh, that'd be great. We're here for you guys. We are your resource. So however we can help.
That's great. This has been very reassuring and I think would be very well received. So. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. This has been recorded and will be posted on the website. So tell your friends if they'd like to come watch it later. And thank you again, Sheyna and Bonnie, for taking your time and presenting this to us. It's obviously very important and we will continue with this. It's not done yet.
Thank you for having us. Everybody take care. Write us anytime. Mahalo, mahalo nut loa. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.